En sjöman älskar havets våg, ja, vågornas brus. När stormen skakar mast och tåg, hör stormarnas sus. Hon trycker då så ömt min hand vid vågornas brus. Då känns det tungt att gå från land i stormarnas sus. Ja, 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 hör vågornas brus.
A sailor's life was hard and arduous. Much was sacrificed to experience the fascination of life on board a sailing ship. Danger was always near. But ships gave men their freedom, and when they were at sea, they were the masters. At sea, women were unnecessary. According to an Åland anecdote, Noah's wife was unbearable until the ark sprang a leak. Then Noah sat her on the leak, which kept her occupied and saved the ark. This explains why women have such cold bottoms. The golden age of sail was at the beginning of the 1870s. Then competition from the enormous barks of iron and steel led to a decline in prices for cargoes, and the small wooden vessels could not compete. The fight against steam was hard, and sailing ships became less common, until at the end of the century, even the great iron and steel barks were struggling for existence. Naval architects and shipping companies did all they could to make sailing ships an economic proposition, but to no avail. Sailing ships did not disappear immediately and simultaneously. The industrialized maritime nations quickly got rid of their sailing ships, while the poorer nations, which didn't have the capital to invest in steamships, used sailing ships far into the 20th century. The world's last owner of a commercial fleet of tall ships was Gustaf Eriksson from Mariehamn. His square riggers were the largest and finest vessels that Finland has ever had. Gustaf Eriksson was 40 years old when, in 1913, he began his career as a ship owner. He had the knack of buying his vessels cheaply and sailing them competently. He seldom paid more for a ship than she could bring in during the first year. The vessels were often in poor condition when he bought them, but he very soon made them seaworthy. Gustaf Eriksson knew all about sailing ships, and he knew his vessels better than those who sailed them. When he was 10 years old, he went to sea as a cabin boy. He rapidly advanced to mate and captain, and then for 11 years was in command of a long list of square riggers. The experience and knowledge he acquired made it possible for him to run his fleet so successfully. Gustaf Ericsson's vessels sailed over all the 7 seas. They sailed with timber from Northern Europe to South Africa and Australia, wheat from Australia to England, and guano from Chile to Europe. Before the First World War, there were plenty of cargoes for sailing ships, and hundreds of them rounded Cape Horn. All the large sailing ships from the Åland Islands were outside the Baltic when the war broke out. During the war years, a freight was worth up to 5 times more than before the war, and the Åland owners made fortunes by taking big risks. Only 10 Åland deep-sea sailing ships survived the war. 14 were sunk or captured. At the sinking of a sailing ship, the crew were usually treated chivalrously and given the chance to take to the lifeboats before the vessel was blown up. After the First World War, most of the large maritime nations wanted to get rid of their remaining deep-sea sailing ships, and they went for scrap prices. Most of the Åland ship owners sold their sailing ships and went over to steam. But Gustaf Eriksson, who believed in the possibilities of the square riggers, bought up all the sailing vessels he could cheaply lay his hands on. The grain trade from Australia to England became more and more important for the last of the deep-sea sailing ships and finally became dominant. The British press created the legend of the grain race. The race created a nostalgia for the era of the tea clippers, when the ships raced each other home with their cargoes of tea and wool. The crews on board experienced the same intense excitement.
Oh, Cap, good girl, stay home, no camps, heave away, heave away, heave away, heave away. They come their hair with cold fish bones, heave away, heave away, heave away, heave away, heave away, my bully, bully boys, heave away, heave away, heave away, heave away, heave away, and don't you make a noise, for we're bound for far Australia.
The vessels didn't leave Australia at the same time, so the winner was the ship that made the passage in the shortest number of days. The four-masted steel bark Herzogin Cecilia was one of the world's finest sailing ships. Gustaf Eriksson bought her in 1921. The vessel was the pride of Gustaf Eriksson. Herzogin Cecilia was built in Bremen in 1902 as a training and representation ship for Norddeutsche Lloyd. She became the public's favorite. She was the fastest and most beautiful ship according to all the press headlines. Her reputation also led to publicity for Gustaf Eriksson, who owned the vessel. The press called him the Windjammer and the last Mohican of the sailing ship epoch. The media described his career from cabin boy to the owner of the world's largest sailing fleet. And in a short time, he was known everywhere in sailing and shipping circles. The shipping company expanded rapidly. Up to 1928, Gustaf Eriksson had bought 16 sailing ships. Finland's Shipping Gazette wrote, "What Paavo Nurmi has done for Finland in the world of athletics, Gustaf Eriksson has done on the high seas. Gustaf Eriksson has enabled Finland to compete in the category of shipping with pretty good results for the economy of the country." The depression of the 30s also hit shipping. Many owners had to accept cargoes at a loss. Hundreds of vessels were laid up every month. Great Britain transferred a large part of her tonnage to flags of convenience. The Finnish fleet could continue to sail because their crews were paid only half that of the British crews. Gustaf Eriksson hoped for better times.
Nowadays, ship owners are not living on the fat of the land. Cargo rates are low. They've never been high, and it's always been difficult. But I think that of all the owners in the world, I have the most vessels in operation.
While 15 of his sailing ships lay without cargoes and the depression was knocking at his door, he increased his tonnage with 6 new deep-sea sailing ships. Eriksson now owned more sailing ships than all the other owners in the world combined. A seaman looking for a job with Gustaf Eriksson was not turned down. Many seamen have told the story of what happened to them while they were waiting to sign on. It usually began like this.
Yes. You want to go to sea, but I've no ships at home for the time being.
I wrote to your honour last year, so I thought that it would soon be my turn for a berth.
Yes, you wrote. But as I told you, I've no ships at home now. What shall we do with you? Johanna! Johanna! Show this man to the woodshed. He can chop wood for the time being.
The moment the maid put the axe in the seaman's hand, he was on the payroll. Wood chopping continued until he obtained a place on board one of Ericsson's ships. Gustaf Ericsson's business friends and ship's chandlers in London encouraged him to give up sailing ships and to concentrate on steam. He answered them,
Since the age of 10, I've grown up with sailing ships, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I love them. Evil tongues say that these sailing ships mean more to me than my wife and children. This is not true, but as long as I live, my sailing ships will sail.
The depression became even worse during the following years, and the number of laid-up ships increased. Ericsson's Windjammers sailed the seas under ballast and hunted like a pack of hungry wolves after their prey. This was only made possible when the crew covered their own costs and the vessel sailed without insurance. The vessels could at least cover their overheads, but £2,000 per year was needed for paint and canvas for a large vessel. A set of sails weighs about 25 tons. Usually, new sails were sewn for one of the masts on each trip round the world. Thus, the vessel's oldest set of sails was 4 years old. Baroness Eva Julandstjerna, who sailed as a passenger on the Herzogin Cecilia, relates,
Herzogin Cecilia had more than 4,000 square metres of sail. The sails were made of thick, stiff sail canvas. It did not seem difficult when you watched the sailmaker at work, and it is a pleasure to see how fast and wonderfully even an experienced sailmaker sews canvas. I then understood that I would never be able to do more than to patch a sail. When the sail was finished, it was so heavy that it needed 12 men to lift it.
Gustaf Eriksson demanded a lot of his crews and always gave advice and instructions. He knew how important it was to keep his vessels and their rigging in good order. Rusty plates had to be scraped and painted. Sail canvas, rope and wire had to be of the highest quality. He went through every nook and cranny, and if anything was not in order, the captain was given a dressing down. Once, when a young seaman oiled the deck too sparingly, Gustaf kicked the oil bucket over and shouted,
Remember, for God's sake, ships and women should always be given full rations.
During the long voyages, which lasted several months, the captain was responsible for everything on board. He acted as judge, policeman, and in cases of accident, as doctor. He performed simple operations and splintered broken arms and legs. Ericsson's captains were less afraid of storms than of causing the company losses. They made voyage after voyage for a wage which was considerably less than they would have made in command of a motor vessel, where the responsibility was less and conditions were more comfortable. They did it because they enjoyed the excitement and life on board sailing ships and because they loved their ships. Between the world wars, when the barks from Åland sailed to Australia for cargoes of grain, the demand for a standard of food was quite different from previously. Seamen, who were often aspiring captains, demanded that the food should be varied, nourishing, and plentiful. Provisions had to be procured for a journey which took several months. Refrigerators and deep freezers didn't exist, and a continual war was waged against rats and parasites. Gustaf Ericsson's motto was,
Feed them, but don't fatten them.
The cook never had an idle moment. He baked, prepared food, fed the pigs and hens. In hard weather, after an exhausting day in the galley, he had to help take in the sails. Ship's cook Harry Hedenström describes his work.
I fed the hens with wheat and grain, and the pigs ate with a good appetite all the scraps which could not be reused. And when we had a cargo of wheat, we cooked the wheat for the pigs in dishwater. In this way, we saved precious fresh water supply. The greatest delicacy for the pigs was a lump of coal. They crunched it between their teeth with gusto once they had a taste for it. First mate home distinctly warned me not to give the pigs more than one lump at a time, because otherwise the pigs refused to eat normal food.
Preparing food is not difficult if one has fresh raw materials. But to prepare tasty meals from beef which has been in a barrel and perhaps rounded the horn once or twice is both laborious and difficult. It was necessary for the cook to shield his body with a thick apron so as not to be scorched by the heat from the large coal-fired cooking range. The deck became so hot that he got blisters on the soles of his feet.
I tried to protect myself from the heat by sealing both of the galley doors and throwing in about 30 buckets of water on the deck. Then it felt comfortable to stand barefoot. I used this technique especially when I was making thin pancakes, because I was obliged to stand in front of the stove continuously until all the hundreds of pancakes were ready.
The company started a wide advertising campaign to attract sea cadets and passengers so that the worst of the depression could be overcome. On July the 21st, 1933, Gustaf Eriksson began the first of Finland's pleasure cruises with the stately four-masted steel bark Lavenier. The vessel was registered as a passenger vessel and had 33 cabins for first and second class passengers. All the furniture, including an upright and a grand piano, was bought from a closed-down restaurant on land. Lavenier was a well-proportioned vessel and with her beautiful lines reminded one of a yacht, a real beauty. She was built in 1908 as a Belgian training ship and was known as one of the world's fastest sailing ships. Lavenier took part in 5 grain races under the Finnish flag and visited Mariehamn each year until she was sold to Germany and renamed Admiral Karpfanger. She disappeared on a cruise 2 years later and went down with all hands. Gustaf Ericsson's other ships had to sign on passengers as crew since they were classified as cargo ships. A trip from England to Australia cost 10 shillings a day. Passengers received the same food as the officers, and before sailing they had to sign a contract that in the event of their death on board, the funeral costs would be borne by their estate. In 1933, Eriksson incorporated the 3-masted bark Elakön into his fleet. She was built in Finland in 1920, and in her youth had sailed in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. Elakön, which was the last wooden bark in the world, was chartered by the Swedish film industry for filming Chief Mate Carlson's Girlfriends and Cruising with Albertina.
Ja, det finns väl ingenting som är så spännande som det.
Vi har haft linjedopp,
Vi har runda goda hopp.
för en månad sen vi slaktat sista grisen. Utan 120 var har vi några timmar kvar.
The ship was sold in 1943 to Helsinki and converted to a motor-driven barge before she finished her days as a jetty. On Gustaf Ericsson's 60th birthday, the newspaper Åland wrote, "It has been said that Finland made the Russian flag well known over the seven seas. Now Gustaf Eriksson from Mariehamn shows that Finland still has sailing ships. When a steamship sights a sailing ship anywhere on the seven seas, it can be certain that 9 times out of 10 it's one of Gustaf Ericsson's vessels. His sailing ships are known all over the world. There had been collisions between steamships and sailing ships, and when Ericsson's bark Hugomont was wrecked on the Australian coast and Melbourne was rammed by an oil tanker off the coast of Ireland, there arose a storm of public opinion against sailing ships. Critics were of the opinion that sailing ships were a relic of the past and should be taken out of traffic. The offensive was led by Captain Lee from Australia.
Sailing ships are a blot on the seascape. They should be removed, and the sooner the better. By not keeping up with the times, bloody-minded Gustaf Eriksson from underdeveloped Finland puts maritime safety at risk with his ancient sailing ships, which by right should be in the scrapyard or a museum.
In Australia, as late as 1939, 13 sailing ships were loaded with their cargoes of grain, and 10 of them were owned by Gustaf Eriksson.
Kom och titta, karar!
Vadå? Nej men kika, en ubåt!
De skjuter ju!
Nej men vad menar de? Akta er!
The Eriksson Shipping Company lost most of its sailing ships during the Second World War. And when the war ended, only Pommern, Viking, Pamir and Passat were able to sail. Gustaf Eriksson had promised that his sailing ships would sail as long as he lived. In 1946, he sent Passat and Viking to Africa with cargoes of timber. Gustaf Eriksson died on August the 15th, 1947. 2 years later, the last cargo of wheat left Australia under sail. Pamir became the world's last square rigger with a cargo which rounded Cape Horn. The age of the proud sailing ships was at an end.
En sjöman älskar havets våg, ja, vågornas brus. När stormen skakar mast och tåg, hör stormarnas sus. Jag avskedar skeppet mitt vid vågornas brus. Det känns så tungt att gå i land i stormarnas sus. Farväl, farväl, du ståtliga skepp.